Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look at Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God, written by Paul Copan. Please pause the video if you'd like to get a closer look at the contents for Is God a Moral Monster?, in which we make sense of the Old Testament God. On previous videos, we've introduced Paul Copan as the Pledger, Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University in the state of Florida. He's written or edited over 20 apologetics and philosophy books and lives in Florida with his family. Chapter 10 in Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan talks about misogyny, the idea that women are oppressed. And the New Atheists will claim that the Bible oppresses women. And we're going to take a look at those claims and see if they're true on this episode of Blessed Man Meditations taken from Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. So, when we start talking about the treatment of women in the Old Testament, the pandemonium, Copan says, begins. Feminists accuse Old Testament writers of endorsing all kinds of sexism, patriarchy, and even misogyny. Patriarchy is the socially oppressive structures favoring men over women, and misogyny is when women are outright hated. So the claim that the Bible is misogynistic is one of the adjectives Richard Dawkins uses to describe the Old Testament God. But as we'll see as we go through this chapter, people like Richard Dawkins and other New Atheists are terribly, terribly, terribly mistaken when they claim that the Bible is misogynistic, or that God is misogynistic, or that God hates women, or that patriarchy, in the sense that the New Atheists mean it, is what's happening, because that's not true about the God of the Bible, as we'll see as we go through this chapter. It's really based on a horrific misunderstanding. So one of the questions is, why does Sarah refer to Abraham, her husband, as my master, like in Genesis chapter 18? Or why do Hebrew girls belong to their father's house, like in Leviticus chapter 22? Why does an Israelite woman remain ceremonially unclean for only 40 days after giving birth to a boy, but 80 days after having a girl, like we learn about in Leviticus chapter 12? Why can't women be priests in Israel? What about all the concubines that the kings had? What about levirate marriage? What about polygamy? Why did God permit polygamy? Doesn't the Old Testament endorse a bride price, which only reinforces that women are property? Boy, the bride price portion of this chapter was incredibly illuminating to me as I went through this. In this chapter, we'll look at the underlying male-female equality that's in the Old Testament, and some passages that allegedly suggest that there was not equality between males and females. Then, in chapter 11, we'll review some key passages related to polygamy, in which men had multiple wives, and concubines, as well as related passages that the critics, the New Atheists, will commonly mention. First, we'll begin by looking at the original ideal, which we found in the opening of the Bible in the first two chapters of Genesis. However, we understand the Levitical laws and Old Testament narratives regarding women. The first two chapters of Genesis point us to the ideal view of women, which is far from a fallen, skewed, or demeaning attitude, like the New Atheists claim the Bible has towards women. God creates male and female in his image. They're both created in his image. Eve is taken from Adam's rib, which is a picture of equality and partnership of equals. And sex, the one flesh union between the husband and wife, is to be enjoyed within the safety of lifelong heterosexual marriage. Although the first two chapters of Genesis spell out the ideal male-female equality, laws regarding women in Israel take a realistic approach to fallen human structures in the ancient Near East. So in the ancient Near East, you'll see this theme oft repeated throughout this book, Is God a Moral Monster? That in the ancient Near East, you had a general moving from a less ideal toward a more ideal structure. And as this progression was taking place, many of these laws came to be written. And as these laws came to be written in this less than ideal society, they are going to have this moral inferiority to what many would expect to see nowadays. But they were in a very underdeveloped society in the ancient Near East. Their society was fallen, just like ours is fallen. And we have immoral laws now in our fallen society. So in Israel's legislation, God does two things. First, he works within a patriarchal society to point Israel within a better path, and God provides many protections and controls against abuses directed at females in admittedly substandard conditions. So God is trying to protect females, and you will see as we go through several of these passages in this book that are cited in this book, you will see that many of these passages that the New Atheists cite as being oppressive towards women, they actually were protected of women. It was remarkable to see this. So do we see examples of oppressed women in the Old Testament? Yes, we do. But we also see lots of oppressed men in the Old Testament as well. In other words, we shouldn't consider these negative examples that take place of the suppression of women or the suppression of men. We should not take these negative examples as endorsements of oppression and abuse. Remember, we're living in the inferior ancient Near East, where there was this progression toward an improved moral situation. So just because a negative law, a negative seeming law is instituted, it doesn't mean that it's the ideal, but it's a progression towards the ideal. So let's look at the equality of women from various angles. Reading the Old Testament reveals two important parallel features. First, patriarchal social structures in Israelite families, alongside the honoring of women as equals, including a bevy of prominent matriarchs and female leaders in Israel. On the one hand, fathers had a legal responsibility for their households, and ancient Near Eastern households could often reach 15 to 20 members. So the fathers had legal responsibility in matters of family inheritance. Fathers had legal responsibility in matters of property ownership. Fathers had legal responsibility in marital arrangements of sons and daughters. And fathers were the spokesman for family matters in general. For instance, when a daughter or a wife took a vow, such solemn promises were to be approved by the father or the husband, because the father or the husband was the legal point person in the home. This represents more than just legal protection for a wife or a daughter, though. Embedded social attitude and ideas die hard, especially in places like the ancient Near East. Patriarchal attitudes were strongly held in the ancient Near East, attitudes that were a far cry from the equality language at creation. So as I said earlier, there was the ideal in the Garden of Eden before sin entered the world. And then, because sin entered the world, people were fallen, and we got further and further away from the ideal. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 affirms that a man was to leave his parents and cling to his wife as an equal partner. But when Satan tempted Eve and Adam and Eve sinned, the fall deeply affected human relationships. As a result, Sarah followed the ancient Near Eastern custom of calling her husband Lord, the Hebrew word Adon, in Genesis chapter 18, verse 12. Sarah gave her handmaid Hagar to Abraham because at the time they hadn't produced a child, and they sinfully got impatient and didn't believe the Lord's promise. And so they took matters into their own hands, which is always a bad thing to do. Sarah gave her handmaid Hagar to Abraham to produce a child. and this was a common ancient Near Eastern practice. Later, King Abimelech took Sarah as his wife in Genesis chapter 20, and when Sarah finally did give birth to Isaac, then she bore a son to Abraham. On the other hand, these embedded patriarchal attitudes distorted many strong biblical affirmations of female dignity and equality. Mothers and wives deserved honor equal to that of the husbands and fathers, and strong matriarchs helped lead Israel and had sway within their households. Strong matriarchs did help lead Israel and did have sway within their households. Yes, the husband was the legal point person for the Israelite family, but we should not automatically assume that women considered this an oppressive arrangement. Just because the man was the legal point person does not mean that the women who lived in those environments thought themselves as being on the receiving end of oppression. In fact, many wives in many Old Testament marriages were, for all practical purposes, equal and equally influential in their marriages and beyond. Think of the Proverbs 31 woman, who is a very influential person. She's important in the city. She has a business. There's all sorts of positive things going on in the Proverbs 31 woman. So, in fact, many passages speak more of protection and care for those who are often taken advantage of, especially widows or divorced women. God is concerned about justice for widows and the other vulnerables of society, such as orphans and non-Israelite strangers or aliens. God sternly warned would-be oppressors that he's on the side of the weak and defenseless. You can see some passages, if you want to look them up on your own, about God being on the side of the weak and defenseless. Now, feminists would dispute the claim that Israelite women and wives were considered equal in personhood and dignity to men or husbands. But let's address this point. Let's see if the feminists are really right. Yes, patriarchal structures strongly influence the mindset of Israelite society. Yet, we see undeniable affirmations of equality in the Old Testament from theological, historical, and legal perspectives. First, let's look at the theological perspective. Female equality is presumed in the following passages. In the book Is God a Moral Monster? Genesis 1 verse 27. So God created man in his own image, God's image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Male and female, he created them both in his own image. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The mother and the father equally responsible for the man that leaves father and mother to join his wife and become one flesh with his wife. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. You're not only supposed to honor your father, but you're supposed to honor your father and your mother. Exodus chapter 21, verse 15. The son who, or daughter for that matter, who struck his, you would not only get put to death for striking your father, you would also get put to death for striking your mother. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16, you were not only supposed to honor your father, you were supposed to honor your father and your mother. And if you did so, your days would be long, and it would be well with you in the land which the Lord your God gave you. Deuteronomy, still on theological. Okay. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18 to 21. So if there is this stubborn or rebellious son, the stubborn or rebellious son would eventually be stoned to death. But this stubborn or rebellious son who would eventually be stoned to death was stubborn or rebellious because they did not obey the voice of their father or the voice of their mother. And the stubborn or rebellious son did not respond to the chastening that their father or their mother gave to them. They did not heed their father or their mother. And the father and the mother were responsible to bring the rebellious son to the elders of the city, to the gate of the city. The one who treated the father or mother with contempt was cursed. You weren't just cursed for treating your father with contempt, you were also cursed for treating your mother with contempt. Your father and you were to revere your father and mother. You weren't just to revere your father, you were also to revere your mother. Okay, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 9. If you cursed your father or your mother, you'd be put to death. In Proverbs chapter 6, verse 20, Solomon writes to keep your father's command and not to forsake the law of your mother. So the commands of the father and the mother were both important. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 22, to find a wife is a good thing, and that he who finds a wife obtains favor from the Lord. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 26, he who mistreats father and chases away mother is a son who causes shame and brings reproach. Proverbs chapter 23, verse 22, listen to your father who begot you and do not despise your mother when she's old. So mutual respect to father and mother. Proverbs 23, 25, let your father and mother be glad, and then an extra positive affirmation for the mother. Let her who bore you, that would be the mother, rejoice. So you see, we're not seeing the man be favored over the woman like the New Atheist will claim. Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verse 3. We have different passages in the book of the Song of Solomon where the mother speaks and the father speaks, or the wife speaks and the husband speaks. And in this one, I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. He feeds his flock among the lilies. When it comes to Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, where Adam's wife is called a suitable helper, Hebrew word ezer, we should recall that rather than suggesting inferiority, the same word is used of God elsewhere in Scripture. We could list more passages on these theological aspects, but you get the idea. First, the still under historical. The Old Testament's full of powerful matriarchs who were highly valued and exerted a great deal of influence. The testimony of the Old Testament authors reveals a perspective that can hardly be called misogynistic. Consider the following list for starters. The matriarchs. You've got Sarah, you've got Hagar, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, and Tamar. These just occur in the book of Genesis. Then you have the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, in Exodus chapter 1. Then you have the Egyptian princess in Exodus chapter 2. You have major women characters in the Old Testament. Miriam and Jethro's 7 daughters, including Zipporah, who became Moses' wife in Exodus chapter 2, Exodus chapter 4, and Exodus chapter 15. Then you have the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers 27. You have Deborah, Ruth, Naomi, Abigail, and Bathsheba from Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, and books of Kings. And let's not forget the excellent Proverbs 31 woman, who incidentally is a great picture of the church. If in the book of Proverbs, if Solomon pictures Christ, then the Proverbs 31 woman pictures the church. But anyway, these strong women stepped forward and wielded influence with the best of men. Now we're going to look at the legal, after looking at the historical side of the issue. Let's look at the legal side. The moral and ceremonial laws of issue presumed that women were not only equal. Okay, so laws in Israel presumed that women were equal. Hear that, you who say that the Bible's misogynistic, that God is misogynistic. The laws presumed that women were equal, and they also shared an equal moral responsibility with men. One author writes that the system of Israel's ritual and purity laws is rather even-handed in its treatment of gender. Some might quibble with the ceremonial uncleanness of menstruation, which obviously affects women and not men, but as we will see, men have their own issues, as purity laws also address the men's issues in those verses that are cited. Leviticus chapter 15, verses 16 to 18. If any man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all his body with water and be unclean until evening. And any garment and any leather on which there is semen, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening. Also, when a woman lies with a man and there is an emission of semen, they shall bathe with water and be unclean until evening. So we have a man having issues being unclean. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 32. Same chapter in Leviticus. This is the law for one who has a discharge, and for him who emits semen and is unclean thereby. Leviticus chapter 22, verse 4. Whatever man of the descendants of Aaron who is a leper or has a discharge shall not eat the holy offerings until he is clean. And whoever touches anything made unclean by a corpse or a man who has had an emission of semen. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 10. If there is any man among you who becomes unclean by some occurrence in the night, then he shall go outside the camp. he shall not come inside the camp. Talking about a man becoming unclean. So the moral, not just the ceremonial aspects of the Levitical laws that address incest and adultery, apply to men and women without distinction. In fact, those claiming that committing adultery against one's neighbor's wife was a property offense in Israel are incorrect. Both the man and the woman can be put to death for adultery, but, unlike the Code of Hammurabi, Old Testament law never requires the death penalty for property offenses. So now let's look at texts that allegedly promote female inferiority. Now it's time to look at some of those potentially embarrassing passages that put down women. First, let's look at the trial of jealousy in Numbers chapter 5. Then after that, we'll look at the impurity at childbirth in Leviticus chapter 12, the levirate marriage in Deuteronomy 25, your neighbor's wife in Exodus 20:17, why there were no female priests. So first, let's look at Numbers chapter 5, at the trial of jealousy. Let's summarize the theme of this text. The summary is that if a man suspected his wife of adultery, he could bring her before the priest to accuse her. In this case, 2 or 3 witnesses were not available. And Deuteronomy chapter 17 said that 2 or 3 witnesses should be summoned. But the only witness was the husband's suspicion that his wife had been cheating on him. Critics charge that this would have been a terrifying ordeal. A cheating wife's abdomen would swell and her thigh would shrivel after drinking this water of bitterness. Critics raise the question, why couldn't a woman bring her husband before the priest if she suspected that he was guilty of adultery? As it turns out, critics have chosen a poor text to illustrate oppression of women. For one thing, consider the context, which gives us every reason to think that the law applied to men as well. Before and after this passage, the legislation concerns both men and women. The Israelites in Numbers 5:2, and it cites in chapter 5 verse 6 a man or woman, and in a man or woman in chapter 6 verse 2. It wasn't just the husband's prerogative to call for the speedy trial; the wife could call for the speedy trial as well. Second, so apparently the wife could do this if she suspected her husband to be guilty of adultery. She could apparently bring him before the priest to accuse him. According to this, the priestly court was actually arranged for the protection and defense of women, not to humiliate them before proud husbands or prejudiced mobs. So the priestly court was to try to defend the women. The law protected women from a husband's violent rage or arbitrary threat of divorce to get rid of his wife cheaply. So the husband was not allowed to just do what the Pharisees did to try to find stupid reasons to get divorced. And if the woman happened to be guilty, she'd rightly be terrified by the supernatural sign affecting her body. In fact, as with the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira in the early church, the Israelites would have a sobering warning regarding God's attitude toward adultery. So let's see, some critics have compared this event to the river ordeal practiced in non-Israelite Near Eastern cultures of Babylon, Assyria, and Sumer. How did this work? When criminal evidence was inconclusive, the accused would be thrown into a bitumen well. That is, a natural petroleum tar commonly used as a sealant and adhesive as a mortar for bricks. In Sumer, this tar river was the abode of the god Id, which means river. Sometimes these jumpers and plungers who went into the god who were overcome by the liquid and its toxic fumes. Most survived. They were spat out by the river god, but it was still a nightmare to endure. If one was overcome by the river, he was guilty, since his death was the river god's judgment. If he survived, he was innocent, and the accuser was guilty of making false charges. There's a big difference between this ordeal and Numbers 5, though. The river ordeal was the general treatment for inconclusive criminal evidence across the board. In the Mosaic Law, however, a charge couldn't be established unless 2 or 3 witnesses were available. Otherwise, the prosecuting side didn't have a case. End of story. In the unique trial of jealousy in Numbers 5, though witnesses weren't available, it's understandable that certain clues might tip off a husband or a wife to something fishy going on with a spouse. Strange behavior, irrational reactions, breaking out into sudden sweats, or simply the husband's belief that he wasn't involved in the wife's conception of a child. Second, If the accused couldn't swim and get out of the tar, he looked guilty even if he were innocent. Not so if an Israelite wife or husband was falsely accused. A telltale supernatural sign was provided to prove guilt. Third, the river ordeal was assumed guilt until innocence. No, the river ordeal assumed guilt until innocence was proven. In the trial of jealousy, the court assumed innocence unless guilt was exposed by a divinely given miracle. All right, next we're going to look at, after the trial of jealousy, we're going to look at impurity at childbirth from Leviticus chapter 12. This passage, some claim, implies female inferiority. The woman is ceremonially impure for 40 days, which is 7 plus 33, after giving birth to a boy, but 80 days, 14 plus 66, after giving birth to a girl. Surely this reveals a lower social status for females, right? Not so fast. Various sensible explanations have been proposed. Some scholars argue that more days for the female actually indicate a kind of protection of females rather than a sign of inferiority. You hear that? Others suggest the motive may be to preserve Israel's religious distinctiveness against Canaanite religion, in which females engage in ritual sexual rites in their temples. In general, a Jewish mother's lengthier separation from the tabernacle or temple after giving birth to a girl made a theological and ethical statement. In ancient Near Eastern polytheism, a strong emphasis on fertility rites, cult prostitution, and the dramatization of the births of gods and goddesses. The distance between the birth event and temple worship, especially with baby girls, was carefully maintained. Another plausible explanation focuses on a natural source of uncleanness, namely the flow of blood. Verse 5 refers to the reason. It's because of the blood of her purification. The mother experiences vaginal bleeding at birth. Yet such vaginal bleeding is common in newborn girls as well, due to the withdrawal of the mother's estrogen while the infant girl exits the mother's womb. So, we have two sources of ritual uncleanness when a girl is born, but only one source of ritual uncleanness when a boy is born. Notice also that when the time of purification is over, whether for a son or a daughter, the mother is to bring the identical offering, whether it's a lamb, a pigeon, or a turtle dove. This is to be a purification offering. It's not technically a sin offering, and its purpose is to take away the ritual, not the moral impurity. Next, we're going to look at levirate marriage in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 10. In this scenario, if a man died without a son to carry on the family name, then his unmarried brother could marry his widow in order to sustain the family name. Legally, the firstborn son from the union was officially the deceased husband's son. Since the first husband was deceased, this wasn't considered incest, or sexual relations with an in-law. The term levirate comes from the Latin word for husband's brother or brother-in-law. The Latin word is called, the Latin word is called levir. First 5 letters of the word levirate. Okay, this legislation sounds quite strange to modern ears, and it certainly does reflect a patriarchal background. A similar practice was carried out by the Hittites. The Hittite law stated that if a man has a wife and then dies, the man's brother must take the widow as his wife. While levirate marriage was an admittedly patriarchal arrangement, we should keep certain things about levirate marriage in mind. First, if the widow did marry her deceased husband's brother, this would keep the widow's property, which she may have brought into the marriage, within the family. So there's a way that the levirate marriage protects the widow. Marrying outside the family meant running the risk of losing it. Second, although the man could refuse, the man refusing was discouraged. Another way of looking at protecting the wife. So not misogynistic, actually looking to protect the woman. And if he refused to comply, the widow herself could exert her role and her rights in the shaming sandal ceremony. So the widow had a certain natural advantage in this arrangement. Well, if it's supposed to be misogynistic, then why is the widow getting a natural advantage? It's instructive to place this levirate scenario next to the story of Zelophehad's daughters from Numbers chapter 27. In the ancient Near East, there existed patriarchal laws of primogeniture, the firstborn's right to receive property and inherit family headship from the father. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17 reveals that this meant a double portion for the firstborn over his brothers. Yet primogeniture is subtly overturned at various points in the Old Testament. Though Mosaic legislation operated within the patriarchal structures of the ancient Near East, the Old Testament reveals a certain dynamism, an openness to change. The daughters of the deceased sonless Zelophehad appealed to Moses regarding the male favoring inheritance laws. In light of the women's particular circumstances, Moses took this matter to God, and the daughter's appeal was granted. When humans sought to change social structures in light of a deeper moral insight and determination to move toward the ideal, we witness an adaptation of ancient Near Eastern structures. Even earlier in the Old Testament, various narratives subtly attack the primogeniture arrangement. The younger regularly supersedes the elder. Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, and Joseph and Judah over Reuben. This biblical sampling reveals a submissive and more democratic ethic. Though not ideal, it's a drastic improvement over other ancient Near Eastern laws. Okay, after levirate marriage, we're going to look at your neighbor's wife from Exodus chapter 20. Verse 17, you shall not covet is the 10th commandment. It prohibits longing for what rightfully belongs to another. What's included in this prohibition? A neighbor's house, a neighbor's wife, a neighbor's male or female servant, a neighbor's ox, a neighbor's donkey, and anything that belongs to your neighbor. Critics complain that a wife is unflatteringly and inappropriately viewed as property, in the same category as a neighbor's house, ox, or donkey. One big problem. Just a few commands earlier, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, children are commanded to give their mother honor equal to that of the father. Children are commanded to honor their mother and their father equally. A mother was to have equal authority over her children to the father. Check out the string of verses cited earlier in this chapter that talked a little bit about that. Another big problem, women in Israel weren't saleable items like houses, oxen, or donkeys. A further revealing fact is that in other cultures in the ancient Near East, a mother was often under the control of the son. Yet the Mosaic law presents a striking contrast in this regard. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3 commands a son to revere mother and father alike, and the mother is even listed first. So why weren't there female priests? Why couldn't women participate in the priesthood? Why was the priesthood restricted to males alone? Many critics have a beef with this males-only religious club. But if you think about it, most Israelite males were excluded from the priesthood too. Priests had to be from the tribe of Levi and from the line of Aaron. Not every Hebrew male was from the tribe of Levi and from the line of Aaron, so they were excluded from the priesthood as well. Also, non-Israelite males were not allowed to be priests. But it's not as though the Old Testament actually places female and priesthood in opposite categories. The Bible says plenty about female priests. Back in Genesis, Eve herself had a priestly role in Eden's garden. Biblical scholars see this location as a sanctuary that foreshadows the tabernacle. Both Adam and Eve carried out priestly duties of worship and service to God, who would walk and talk with them. God would walk and talk with Adam and Eve. Later, the priesthood was extended to the entire nation of Israel, both male and female. God desired that all Israelites approach him as a kingdom of priests. All Israelites. So that's going to include males and females. However, they refused to go up to the mountain, so Moses went in their place. As a result, an official male priesthood was formed to function within the tabernacle and temple structure. So having female priests is not inherently problematic or unbiblical. Indeed, the New Testament reaffirms this. With the death and resurrection of Jesus, a new Israel, the church, was created. It is a holy priesthood and a kingdom of priests who offer up spiritual sacrifices to God. The religions of the ancient Near East commonly included fertility cult rituals, goddess worship, and priestesses who served as the wife of the god. Temple prostitutes abounded, and sexual immorality was carried out in the name of religion. To have sex with priestesses meant union with the goddess you worshipped. In fact, sex with a temple prostitute would prompt Baal and his consort Asherah to have sex in heaven, which in turn would result in fertility all the way around. So you'd have more kids, more cattle, and more crops. Sex was deified in Canaan and other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Adultery was fine as long as sex was religious. If we become what we worship, then it's not surprising the Canaanite religion and society became corrupted by sacred sex. Therefore, Canaanite female and male cult prostitutes were forbidden. Israel wasn't to imitate the nations whose deities engaged in sexual immorality. Were these religions tolerant? Yes, in all the wrong ways. From the gods downward, all kinds of sexual deviations were tolerated, but to the detriment of society and family. Indeed, many ancient Near Eastern law codes permitted activities that undermined family integrity and stability. For example, men were permitted to engage in adulterous relations with slaves and prostitutes. The laws of Lipitishtar of Lower Mesopotamia take for granted the practice of prostitution. In Hittite law, if a father and son sleep with the same female slave or prostitute, it is not an offense. As an aside, Hittite law even permitted bestiality. If a man has sexual relations with either a horse or a mule, it is not an offense, according to Hittite law. The law of Moses sought to prevent Israelites from glorifying adultery or bestiality in the name of religious devotion. Keeping an all-male priesthood then helped create this kind of religious distinction as well as preserve the sanctity of marriage. It wasn't a slam against women to have only male priests. It was a matter of preserving religious purity and the sanctity of sex within marriage, which is why there were no female priests. Keep in mind that in Israel, priests carried out three kinds of duties: teaching duties, judicial duties, and administrative duties. They carried out prophetic duties, such as discerning God's will through the casting of lots, known as the Urim and Thummim. Israelite priests carried out cultic duties, religious ceremonies, and rituals. In Old Testament Israel, women like Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah fulfilled the first two roles as teachers, judges, and prophetesses. The third area was prohibited to women and most other males. The religious ceremonies and rituals women were prohibited from the religious ceremonies and rituals, and most other males were prohibited from the religious ceremonies and rituals. In fact, even Israel's kings couldn't carry out various cultic duties. The cultic duties, again, are comprised by religious ceremonies and religious rituals. So while patriarchalism was embedded in Israelite attitudes, that wasn't what kept women from being priests. Patriarchy was not what kept women from being priests. Rather, what kept women from being priests was Israel's religious identity and moral well-being. We could cover more territory than this, but hopefully these responses to the critics' arguments will help put these passages in context and put some of the contentiousness to rest. That's the end of Chapter 10 in Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. Next, we're going to look at Chapter 11, in which we will discuss polygamy, concubinage, and other such questions in the bride price chapter, which was another enlightening chapter. So, thank you for tuning in today to Blessed Man Meditations, this installment from Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, in which we have made sense of the Old Testament God. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work, the volume on the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms, entitled Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. Please pray for this ministry, that more people would find it, that we would be able to correct some of these misperceptions that the new atheists bring against God, the God of the Bible. I think this resource here, Paul Copan's book, is an incredible resource in that way. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.